On November 21, 2013, Ukraine erupted into civil unrest. The massive demonstrations were sparked by the decision of Ukraine's then-president, Viktor Yanukovych, to discard an agreement with the European Union, which would have seen Ukraine move toward eventually joining the EU. Instead, President Yanukovych announced that he would seek closer ties with Russia, to the surprise of no one as he was already considered a Russian puppet. What nobody expected was how the Ukrainian people would react to Yanukovych trying to tie their future to Russia instead of Europe. The protests soon turned violent, with the demand that the president and his entire cabinet step down. Named one of the most corrupt governments in the world by Transparency International, President Yanukovych had a long history of violence against his citizens and taking bribes, especially from Russian-backed sources. Eventually, President Yanukovych was forced to flee the country, and then the rebellion quickly installed a pro-European president in power. However, that's when Ukraine's troubles would really start. Finally believing themselves to be free of Russian influence, Ukraine instead found itself fighting off a secession movement in the regions of Donbas and Crimea, fueled by Russian separatists. When Ukrainian troops moved to quell the rebellion, they were surprised to find themselves in combat with Russian tanks, infantry, and even special forces. For its part, Russia denied any involvement despite the documenting of unmarked Russian military vehicles carrying dead Russian soldiers back to Russia from Ukraine. President Putin instead claimed that any Russians fighting in Ukraine were doing so on their own free will and that the government had no official role in the fighting there. Even more evidence, including social media posts from Russian soldiers themselves, dispelled any notion that Putin hadn't sent troops to Ukraine. Outmatched by Russian firepower, Ukraine's troops suffered a catastrophic defeat and were forced back, eventually all but ceding control of the disputed regions to pro-Russian forces. In response, the world slammed Russia with crippling economic sanctions, and US President Barack Obama ordered additional US forces to Europe in order to warn Putin from further aggression. Since Putin's original invasion of Crimea, however, things have changed dramatically in the world. Russia is still under punishing economic sanctions, yet it's Russia's common people who are suffering the effects, not Putin or his oligarch friends. Willing to have his people shoulder the economic pain he himself is unaffected by, Putin has thus far not been deterred by sanctions. Now the question on everyone's mind is, will Putin decide to finally invade Ukraine or not? Perhaps nobody is more afraid of this than the Ukrainians themselves, especially after Putin announced that he would grant expedited Russian citizenship to the inhabitants of Crimea. This is but one in several carefully planned moves by Putin to legitimize Russia's claim to the region. As once it's full of legal Russian residents, he'll have a better argument for supporting his currently illegal annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, which is unrecognized by both Ukraine and the rest of the world. Even more worrying, however, is a recent documentary released in Russia this summer where Putin himself makes the claim that several Eastern European nations illegally took territory with them that belonged to native Russia after the breakup of the Soviet Union. To anyone living east of Germany, Putin's statement is tantamount to threatening the invasion of not just Ukraine but any Russian neighbor. To a student of history, the current Russia-Ukraine situation sounds suspiciously a lot like the pre-World War II Germany's Sudetenland debacle that all but officially signaled the start of the Second World War. Would Russia really go for it and invade, however? Much like during Hitler's time, the West is showing some level of appeasement toward Putin's claims on Eastern Europe. Only this time, it's the United States who's doing the appeasement. Despite claims of being tough on Russia, US President Donald Trump has repeatedly ignored Russian actions in Ukraine and shown little to no interest in how the Ukrainian crisis plays out. With his gifting of Syria to Russia by ordering the pullout of US personnel, now the world's wondering if President Trump would dare oppose Putin on the world stage. If Russia wanted to use military force in Ukraine and annex the entire nation, there is little that Europe could do to stop it on their own. Without American military power, the EU simply couldn't field a large enough armed response to stop the Russian incursion, let alone reverse it. While Europe has known for decades that the transatlantic alliance with the US was strong and that America could be relied upon, the relationship has dramatically weakened over the last 4 years under President Trump, leaving many to wonder if the US would respond at all to a Russian invasion. To complicate matters even worse, a recent revelation led to the discovery that President Trump was aware of Russian bounties paid out by its government to insurgents who killed US troops. Yet the information did not stop him from campaigning for Russia to rejoin the G8 after it was kicked out due to its invasion of Crimea. Despite the discovery by the CIA of bounties as high as $100,000 for each dead American soldier paid out by Russia's GRU, President Trump's pro-Russia campaigning signals that the US will almost certainly not interfere with the Ukrainian invasion. But would Russia really do it? With the EU unable to stop Russian military, the most they could do is impose even more sanctions, and yet Russia is already weathering pretty severe sanctions, so the economic impact at this point would probably not be enough to stop Putin if he really wanted to invade. Further adding to the risk of invasion is the fact that Putin himself is facing a variety of domestic troubles, ranging from a poor economy to civil unrest, as Putin sets himself up to remain in power indefinitely. A rally around the flag event such as a Ukrainian invasion might be seen to Putin as a solution, even if temporary, to his domestic troubles. Opposition in Ukraine would be stiff, however, thanks to the thousands of anti-tank weapons sold to Ukraine by the US. With little to no utility in fighting against rebels in Crimea who don't operate tanks, these weapons are very clearly meant to take on Russian tanks and armored vehicles. This would make a Ukrainian invasion a costly one for Russia, no doubt factoring into Putin's plans for the region. Ultimately, Russia could invade Ukraine successfully and re-establish some of the former Soviet Union glory that Putin so desperately wants to recreate, but it's events in America that will likely dictate if that happens or not, more than events in Europe. With President Trump showing no interest in countering any Russian moves around the world, if re-elected, it's likely that Putin will see this as a green light to do as he wishes in Ukraine and elsewhere. As Ukraine is not a NATO member, its best it could hope for would be an armed response from European forces. But without US forces, Europe is simply not strong enough on its own to stand up to Russia. Now, check out Can Russia Invade Europe? Or watch this other video instead.